Going to be Sarah Driggs. She wrote the book on Monument Avenue. She also wrote the National Historic Landmark nomination, which was the first street ever designated a National Historic Landmark. Monument Avenue Commission, which was convened by Mayor Stoney. She also was a member of that. She's an architectural historian with the Richmond focus since the 1980s, and she's my mom. So I really like her. Yeah, so Sarah Driggs.
These are some really critical photos that I quickly emailed to Kat yesterday afternoon. One of those passed for, just in case any of you don't know what the statues look like. I think that's unlikely. And because I get to stand up right away and speak, I want to say about what Anna said. I feel very much the same way, and here a lot of my focus for the past 20 years has been Monument Avenue. But I feel like Monument Avenue is another generation's mistake, another time's mistake, and okay, if we have time to fix it, terrific. But our duty is to grab Shockoe Bottom before everything disappears, before it gets developed with hotels and baseball stadiums and whatever anybody else's idea is to put there, and interpret it in a way that's our job, to say what happened there. And I think that should be our focus. Now that doesn't mean I don't have a whole lot of opinions about Monument Avenue too. And I took my assignment to talk about the history of Monument Avenue very literally, because I feel like let's get on the same page. I'll give you the facts with, you'll notice some slight interpretations, but I'm gonna really try to go over in a certain amount of time what happened on Monument Avenue, okay? So and I'm gonna read because I ramble. Two separate groups of people built Monument Avenue, and they had different purposes. One group was looking to the future and saw Richmond as a city who was ready to move on after the Civil War and ready for business, and they wanted to be a modern city. It was businessmen and people in real estate and the building trades, and they said, let's build a beautiful modern street based on current architectural and city planning ideas and attract new business to Richmond, Virginia, and make it something other than the capital of the Confederacy. The other group wanted, they were looking to the past and saw the future through the lens of the Confederacy. And they wanted to reimagine a future which would rebuild a South that was once again completely controlled by the white race. And although these two groups were separate, they worked together to achieve their goals. And it was a little mushy, but they were two entirely separate groups of people. There was no overlap, which is so interesting. The people who built the houses were not involved in raising the monuments. The people that raised the monuments did not live on Monument Avenue. The plan to build a monument to Robert E. Lee was hatched as soon as he died in 1870, but for various reasons that I don't have time to go into, it took until 1890 for the statue. 131 years ago today, I don't think anyone has mentioned that, the Lee Monument to be unveiled. Richmond was chosen as the location for a statue of Robert E. Lee early on in the process, but the Monument Avenue site was a very late decision. Virginia Governor Fitzhugh Lee, who was Robert E. Lee's nephew, had a friend named Otway Allen who owned property around here, and it was at the edge of the Richmond city limits at the time, at the end of Franklin Street, which was the most fashionable street in town at the time. And in the late 1880s, Allen offered to donate a piece of land for the site of the monument. The circle of land he offered was at the axis of two divided boulevards that had not yet been laid out, and the lots along them were planned to be sites for large houses. Allen was developing this land as a new suburb, and the monument would be a bonus for him, a prestigious national attraction. The committee selected the site for many of their own reasons, including that it could provide a clear, open view of the monument,
unlike a lot of crowded urban areas that were being suggested around town. It was on access down Franklin Street with the seat of government at Capitol Square. That seemed important. It was in line with the Washington Equestrian in Capitol Square, which was very meaningful. And it offered a new stylish neighborhood that would provide a setting that could attract wealthy people to Richmond. They were very aware of that. And the eventual real estate development would provide new taxes. Always important. Wide boulevards like this had been built in Paris and other European cities, and also in Boston and Baltimore, and the people of Richmond knew this and knew that it was the new stylish thing. Richmond was basically investing in the City Beautiful movement. And today I'm not really going to focus on this real estate and city planning aspect of the development, but I wanted you to know that's sort of how the site was selected and the neighborhood was created. The other main impetus behind Monument Avenue was the determination of the other group, who was looking for a future that would be shaped by the past. They wanted to justify the South's actions during the Civil War through ideas which became known as the cult of the lost cause. By 1890, a full generation had passed since the war ended, and the carnage of the war was beginning to fade in people's memories. Southerners began to put a new spin on their role in the war. They depoliticized and romanticized the war by playing up the so-called nobility and sacrifices of the individual leaders like Davis and Lee and Jackson. Their personal virtues were stressed and highlighted, and their cause was downplayed. States' rights, a concept outlined in the U.S. Constitution, was promoted as the justification for secession. My lie. When slavery was mentioned, it wasn't as the cause of war. It was justified as a mere tool necessary to preserve a way of life and an economic system. Slavery was usually excused as a charitable gesture meant to provide a better, more useful life for the enslaved than they could provide for themselves. This was all intended to help the white people of the South walk away from the defeat and humiliation they had experienced and re-enter American life with some dignity. This movement became even more robust after the passage of the 1902 Virginia Constitution. And I don't go into that too much, but if you don't know about it, you should look it up. The 1902 Virginia Constitution. We can see now that all this was false news and pure marketing, but it worked astoundingly well. One reason is that textbooks were rewritten and warped to paint the South through the lens of the lost cause, teaching this false narrative for generations. Statues and monuments were erected all over the South, and the Confederate battle flag continues to play a role in everyday life in the South. The monument committee that Governor Lee formed chose the site at the end of Franklin Street and then chose a man named Marius Jean Antonin Mercier as their sculptor. Clearly he was French. Mercier, one of the most prominent sculptors in the world at that time, proposed a statue that depicted Lee riding a horse across a field of fallen soldiers. But he eventually portrayed Lee alone, a stoic, noble man astride a strong horse solemnly heading south. The committee that negotiated with the sculptor specifically asked for a pose that showed Lee as wise and calm. They wanted to steer clear of militaristic and aggressive because, understand, this was a publicity campaign, and they wanted to influence public opinion. They were selling the war as economic self-defense. John Mitchell Jr., the African-American editor of the Richmond Planet, a teacher, a banker, and city alderman, wrote angry editorials condemning the monument and the movement that supported it, pointing out that they were praising a legacy of both treason and blood. He was on city council and voted against dedicating any city funds to the monument. But we all know what happened. The unveiling finally took place on May 29, 1890. It included the longest parade in Richmond history, taking over 2 hours to pass a single point, which may not sound long to us, but think about how many gaps there are in our parades. Everybody stops for the TV camera to wave. Then they were pretty jammed in. Many old soldiers came to march and reminisce, and as you might have guessed, the speeches that day depoliticized Lee, praising his sense of duty and devotion to the Southern people. During the next 15 years, the Lost Cause really picked up speed, and Richmond found itself a sentimental favorite to physically embody the Lost Cause, with Monument Avenue as its crown. Across the South, state governments were under pressure because their resentful citizens were stuck in unprofitable agricultural economies. Something had to change, and they chose to look backward. The North may have won the war and the enslaved had been freed, but most of the white people of the South had no intention of allowing the formerly enslaved to thrive. Virginia joined other Southern states in 1902 when they rewrote the state constitution to restore white supremacy by making it next to impossible for African Americans and working class whites to vote. By the time Jeb Stuart was sculpted by Frederick Moynihan early in the next century, a warlike pose seemed acceptable. The Convention of 1902 had reestablished the white race's dominance, and the South had enthusiastically sent many soldiers to the Spanish-American War in Cuba, contributing to a national cause, so the region's re-entry into American society was going smoothly. The dramatic swagger and aggressiveness of Stuart didn't seem as inflammatory as it would have earlier for Lee. Jeb Stuart and the next sculptor, Jefferson Davis, were both unveiled a week apart at the same Confederate reunion in 1907, possibly the largest reunion ever held in Virginia, 42 years after the end of the Civil War. Davis's statue portrayed him as a senator and an orator, and the frieze behind him quotes the words of his speech when he resigned his post in the U.S. Senate to return south at the beginning of the Civil War. In that speech, he referred to states' rights guaranteed by the Constitution as the justification for secession. The monument was even topped by an allegorical statue of the South named Vindicatrix. So Lee, whose original pose was toned down because of aggressiveness, was followed 17 years later by not one but two sculptures. One, a cavalry officer brandishing a sword, which was followed less than a week later by a politician backed up by an allegorical figure whose name was based on vindication. Both unveiled at enormous Confederate reunions. So if you don't think that says that Confederates felt they were back in charge, you really weren't paying attention. And as a parallel to this somewhat dry art historical explanation of the trajectory of white supremacy at the time, I want to let you know that this same year, 1907, was a big spike in lynchings across the United States. Stonewall Jackson's placement at the Boulevard in 1919 came a full 54 years after the Civil War ended, only 1 year after the end of World War I, which was up until that point the most deadly war in the history of the world, and 1 year after a global influenza pandemic killed 400,000 Americans alone. And we're still talking about the Civil War. Jackson's serenity was key to his portrait, which seemed misplaced to all of us when you viewed him gazing into the distance above one of the busiest intersections in the Fan. The aggression of the Stuart and Davis monuments have been abandoned, and most likely because the adherents of the Lost Cause had won their battle. Matthew Fontaine Maury was sculpted and unveiled in 1929. He's the only Confederate on Monument Avenue who sometimes needs an introduction, usually needs an introduction. The other subjects of the monuments on the avenue are well known for their military and political support of slavery. Many people also know of their personal history with enslaved peoples. I'm going to go into more detail about Maury because he is less familiar and he had such extreme views on slavery. Maury served in the Confederate Navy and is known for experiments that resulted in the invention of the torpedo, but he was primarily a scientist. He served as superintendent of the U.S. Naval Observatory and Hydrographical Office, which is quite a tongue twister, and while there helped establish the science of oceanography. His work with meteorology was the beginning of the Weather Bureau. He's known as the Pathfinder of the Seas for his work in oceanography. He wrote the Guide to Seamanship that was taught at the Naval Academy until just recently. He was also unrelenting in his support of the Confederate cause. In 1851, Maury had advocated for the transfer of enslaved African Americans and Southern planters to the Amazon rainforest to process raw materials for commercial export. Though that plan failed, at the end of the Civil War in 1865, Maury devised another unsuccessful immigration plan that encouraged ex-Confederates to settle in Mexico with the African Americans they formerly enslaved. Maury's plan aimed to use freed people as a labor source in a system of indentured servitude that mimicked slavery. Though Maury's monument was originally floated as a memorial to his scientific career, the fundraising failed until the United Daughters of the Confederacy got involved. Their appeal to school children to bring pennies and nickels brought the needed funds to the project, so his Confederate connections were crucial to the completion of the statue. Maury was depicted seated in front of a globe, listening to storms and evidently thinking big thoughts. Maury's ideas were represented literally as larger than him, a point that was meant to praise his scientific achievements, but enshrined his racist ideology as well. Once again, the achievements of a Confederate were being praised on Monument Avenue, this time in 1929, 64 years after the war ended. Pretty stunning. The next sculpture on Monument Avenue was Arthur Ashe, done by Paul de Pasquale, and it was unveiled on July 10th, 1996. So I'm going to let Paul cover that because he knows it a little more intimately than I do. But I do have one comment about it. During the unveiling of the Lee Monument, 131 years ago today, this is the Lee Monument. The main speaker said something that he believed applied to Lee, but it seems now is much more appropriate to say about Ashe. Let this stand as a memorial of personal honor that never brooked disdain. Let this man then teach to generations yet unborn these lessons of his life. Let it stand not as a record of civil strife, but as a perpetual protest against whatever is low and sordid in our public and private relations. So, Monument Avenue was founded by groups looking both to the past and the future. Those looking to the past honored the Lost Cause, a propaganda campaign that inspired the enthusiasm that drives people to look back past larger, more recent, more deadly wars and obsess about the loss of one that was fought to preserve the enslavement of other humans.